Well, hi, and welcome back to Risk Management. Today's lecture is on frequencies and probability. This is the final segment in a series of classes in which we had explored the issues of phenomena and their relationship to illusions in nature that we have to try to quash in order to find the real essence of things. That's important when we're trying to determine causation and, in turn, risks. So today we're going to talk about frequencies and probability. This will be our first foray into the topic, but it won't be our last. We'll come back to this a number of times in the class. Today is just an introductory overview. So I want to talk a little bit about frequencies, which are raw data that collected from observations that yield statistics for us. You've heard of many of these things before. They usually come in two flavors. One is sort of a centralizing tendency, and the other is a dispersion tendency. Examples of a convergent centralizing tendency includes things like the average, you've heard of that, median, or mode, three different ways of measuring a centralizing force in observations that we make. Dispersion, scattering from that central average, is usually measured by things like standard deviation, variance, or a fancy word called kurtosis. Different types of curves exist, and you'll see here in the bottom right of your corner, three different curves. One with a very sharp, narrow point, one that's sort of a bell curve, and one with wide tails, each of which captures in that image two sets of information. One is how likely it is that some sort of central average occurs, that's the sharp peak in the middle, and depending on how fat the tails are and the skew of the curve, how likely it is for other outliers to occur. So we're measuring both centralization tendencies as well as dispersion tendencies from that center average point when we are looking at frequencies. Pretty straightforward. If you haven't had statistics as an undergraduate, it's okay. You won't need it to understand what we're going to talk about in this class. Why do we quantify and record frequencies? Well, the answer is it does two things for us. It eliminates certain types of bias, and it also eliminates what's called chance. Now, these are two things that interfere with our ability to find the true essence of something. Bias and chance can both make it seem, illusorily, that a meaningful determined event has occurred, when in fact it has not. Bias and chance are, in other words, defeaters. Without controlling for them, you don't have objective knowledge, or the essence of what's going on causally. A couple of scientists who really did some great work on this back in the 1980s, going all the way back to actually to the 1960s, were Robert Dawes and Paul Meehl. Meehl was a very famous psychologist, and in 1989 they published sort of a life's collection of work that they had done, where they concluded that looking at a whole variety of places where people have to make decisions, such as wardens in prisons deciding which of their releasees and parolees are going to be, in fact, criminal recidivists who come back to prison. For college professors trying to decide what grades to give to students in college based on their performance. For psychiatrists trying to diagnose whether someone has psychiatric illness. For physicians who are oncologists trying to determine whether or not someone who has cancer is likely to live, and if so, how long. And finally, stock analysts trying to predict the movement of prices of stocks. And what Meehl did in a lot of these studies was he would ask experts and go around the country and talk to lots of people and say, give me your best prediction of any of these things that we've just described. And he would try to work in questions to them saying, what factors are you taking into account when you make these decisions? And people would give them a list of factors. For example, for recidivists in prison, for wardens, they might say the type of crime they committed before when they came to prison, or how long they served in prison, or whether they were in a gang or something like that. So those were things that he would ask, and then he would do something very interesting. He would take a simple statistical equation and plug in variables for each of those things that the wardens had mentioned. The gang affiliation, how long people had been in prison, and so forth, and run a statistical model trying to predict whether or not someone released from prison would in fact end back up in prison. What he found was very interesting. Across the board, no matter what topic it was he seemed to look at, with the exception of facial recognition, He found that in general, machines and computer algorithms beat human beings in able to predict outcomes. Even experts were not able to keep up with his simple statistical models. Of course, the models were based on expert input for what they were looking at, but what Meehl was showing is that selective recall of experts, fatigue, bad memory, emotions, overconfidence, and so forth, cloud judgment. They create illusions of confidence and illusions of truth that do not in fact exist. Now notice something Meehl wasn't saying. He wasn't saying that all experts were beat all the time by the statistical models. In fact, some experts always outperformed the models. The problem was you never knew in advance, and there's no great way to predict which ones those experts are. So what Meehl came away with was basically saying, statistics seems to control pretty well for a lot of the biases that human beings bring to their expert judgment decision making. It's an interesting study. What biases does statistics not control for, though? That's important also to recognize. Two things that are automatically almost always things you have to consider, and we'll see examples of these in a moment. First, measurement or observation bias. We spent the last 3 lectures looking at various forms of illusions. If you have garbage that you stick into your equation, you'll get garbage out every time. So if you do not record phenomena correctly, if you're tricked up by illusions, your model of causation will not improve simply because you stuck garbage into it. Second, something called sampling or extrapolation bias also is something that statistics doesn't typically control well for. We'll see both of these examples momentarily. Let's talk about measurement bias, the first of these two. I like to use the expression GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. This is basically observational error, recording illusions or hallucinations or other things of that nature of phenomena as real events. When you do this, you don't actually gain knowledge, even if you use statistics to track what it is you recorded. An example, in the 1940s, the Navy used rangefinder experiments to try to measure distances, and they record those distances based on what sailors observed through binoculars and reported as the distance that a shell would fire or something of that nature. What they found was that the data were off, and they couldn't figure out what was going on until they realized that about 20% of the sailors that they had used in these studies had reported incorrect data because they did not have stereoscopic vision, binocular vision in both eyes. And so they were misreporting the distances that shells were fired. That gave very bad, faulty data and skewed the studies. Again, garbage in, garbage out. If your eyes don't show you the truth and you record what your eyes did show you, you're not going to do well with the statistics based on those observations of phenomena, or in this case, illusions. Doesn't always just have to be visual, though. Even wording can trigger emotional or other sorts of misrepresentations that are measurement bias. Polls are notorious for this. In presidential elections, such as our upcoming one, you'll see many circumstances where people will poll and they're not polling correctly by using the right wording. That wording is not neutral and wording matters. Here's an example that Lester gives us from 2004. He phrased the following question to different subjects in a large study. He said, as you know, the term Holocaust usually refers to the killing of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps during World War II. Does it seem possible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? Now notice something. There's a part here in yellow on your screen. He asked the question one way just as I read it, leaving out that yellow component of the question. Then he asked a different group of people the same question, but he included the yellow component, saying instead, does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? What he found was quite interesting, that when you ask the question without the highlighted text, only 9% of people deny the Holocaust. But when you ask it including that statement, something that shouldn't seem to make a difference, double the number of people deny the Holocaust. Well, that's just a matter of measurement bias. How you ask the question recorded a different result. There's some sort of illusion going on in use of wording that triggers problems for your statistics later. The other type of issue that comes up is sampling bias. Statistics don't control well for this. It takes good judgment and careful statistician work to overcome it. We say that a statistical estimator is biased if for any reason it has an inherent tendency to over or underestimate the statistic. That's true for measurement bias, which we've just seen, or in the case of sampling bias, the same. Here's an example of sampling bias. Let's say we wanted to know the average height of the adult American male. We might go and sample some people to see who that is. We can't have enough money and enough time to go out and find every last adult male in America to do this. There's several 100 million of them. And so maybe we want to just do a sample and try to project, based on that sample, what we think the American male's average height is. So let's say we go to the NBA, the National Basketball Association. We take 10 players and we conclude based on our study that the average American male is 6 foot 8 inches tall. That's our sample average. The problem, of course, is this sample is not representative of the American public. It's skewed. And so, again, garbage in, garbage out. If you take an estimate of a group that is biased and not representative of the group that you are trying to represent it to be representative of, then you are in fact incorrect. Statistics will not fix that, by the way. Okay, the other component that statistics tries to control, besides biases, is chance. Chance. Chance is an interesting concept, and we're going to come back to it later in another class, but I want to introduce it here. Here's what a rough understanding of chance is. To understand it, we need to define three different terms: frequency, probability, and chance. Frequency is when we make a series of observations of an event occurring. For example, if we flip a fair coin, heads and tails, 10 times, it might be the case that heads comes up 7 times. That's not impossible for a fair coin to do with a limited number of tosses. Everyone's had this happen before. It's not always a 50-50 result, even if it's a fair coin. We would then say that the frequency of that coin toss was 7 out of 10. Probability, on the other hand, is the number of times an event is expected to occur. So if we took the exact same coin and flipped it 10 times, we would say the probability of landing on heads would be 5 out of 10. Notice here the probability and the frequency are not the same. Frequency is 7 out of 10, probability is 5 out of 10. Chance is the random, unexplainable difference between the observed frequency and the expected probability. In this case, 2 out of 10 times, chance seemed to occur. Something out of the ordinary, not in accordance with our expectations, but what we have observed. Okay. How do we handle chance? Chance is a tricky topic, and it's philosophically complex too, because some people don't accept that there's chance. They say there's no such thing as chance. All things are work together in some sort of very large, holistic, complex web. And we're going to come back to such ideas, particularly when we get to financial studies. But when we're talking about frequency versus probability, is there really a difference between expectations and observation? Different philosophers take different views on this, and without complicating the matter and going too in depth, I'll give you 3 different philosophical positions people have taken at different times in history. I tend to prefer the third myself, but I'm open to the fact that others do not share the same. The frequentist position is number 1. It says that whatever we have observed is the probability by its fact itself. So if you flip a coin 3 times and it lands heads 3 times in a row, we say the probability of heads is 1. Well, the problem I find with that is we might be able to take into account things other than what just has happened before. For example, if we take into account laws of nature and the fact that heads can come up and tails can come up because we've inspected both sides of the coin, we might understand that just because it's come up 3 times heads in a row doesn't mean we've ruled out as impossible. If you think back to our talk about the omega set of possibilities, known possibilities, that tails could come up. Of course, the frequentist rebuttal to this is, yes, but until the tails comes up, you don't actually know that it can. Counterfactualism is the second philosophy. It says you assign probabilities to all different possible outcomes, taking into account the relative amount of evidence in favor of each outcome. This was that probabilistic causation approach that we dealt with in the probabilistic causation lecture a while back. The third probability theory is propensity theory, which Karl Popper, a famous philosopher, put forth in 1957. He said that probability is a long-run trend. It's compelled by natural forces and laws for events to occur in a certain way. There's some ultimate outcome if you do things enough, he says. There may, however, be short-run deviations from that, where the frequencies are different from the long-run probability. The frequency, in other words, has a propensity over time and with enough events to converge with the probability. But, he says, there's no probability for non-repeat one-time events. You can't assign it, for example, what's the likelihood that the moon will crash with Earth? It only will do it once, and we don't have a way of estimating it. Okay, with those philosophies as background, I want to turn to the concept of the law of large numbers. This is a concept that says as the size of your sample population gets very large, the cumulative frequency, the number of different observations you've made, becomes identical with the probability. This is kind of a comforting concept. It says if we can get a very large sample size, that in fact it doesn't really matter which philosophy about frequencies and probabilities we subscribe to. In all those three examples I gave you of different philosophies, each one would agree that the law of large numbers applies, meaning that probability equals frequency in the long run with enough observed data points. The question, of course, then comes up, well, what if we don't have enough data points? What if we aren't in the luxurious position of having such a thing? What do we do then? With a smaller frequency, a smaller number of observations, frequencies can be compared to a suspected probability distribution, for example, a bell curve, to see whether the observed events are because of chance. Now notice something, and I'm going to come back to this in another slide in a moment to explain this further detail. This idea, which was put forth mathematically by a man named William Gossett in 1908, does not work if you guess the incorrect probability distribution to compare your frequency to. So for example, if I'm flipping a fair coin and I think it is fair, I might be very surprised if I come out with 10 heads in a row. If the suspected probability distribution is not correct because I'm not flipping a fair coin, the probability of heads would be 1, then my statistics are going to be off when in fact I don't get that result. Chance can never be totally ruled out. Chance variations or side reactions are always taking place. They never completely cancel each other out, and there results in accumulation which sooner or later provides a trend in a different direction from that of the original system, says John Bernal. See, scientists want to rule out chance, and we can rule out a lot of it using hypothesis testing, which we just talked about, and we're going to talk about again in another slide, but we can't ever get rid of all chance in the universe. And that's problematic because it means there's things we can't explain going on, that the causation isn't ever perfect, that we don't actually definitively know things, and that might make us uncomfortable. Scientists are usually comfortable if they're 95% clear at ruling out the chance. That's the cutoff line they use. But you might say, well, I need it at a 99% level. Sometimes that will happen, or a 90% level. That will happen. But we never ever really are in the luxury of having 100% knowledge. And so when we speak of certainty and scientific knowledge, we have to admit, underlying all our assumptions, there's a little bit of chance lurking in the basement. Okay, back to hypothesis testing for a moment. Let's say we get an unusual frequency distribution. We see something unusual coming up. Is it due to chance, or is the probability distribution different than we suspected? If it's chance, we can draw a cutoff if we know the probability distribution. For example, you'll see this curve here at the top of your page that looks like a bell curve. We know roughly how bell curves work, and we know what the chance is that something can occur. Given a bell curve is the probability distribution. If something occurs with a certain frequency, we can then say whether or not it was due to chance that there was a difference from the bell curve, or in fact supposed to be done exactly the way it was. The problem, of course, comes up, what if the curve isn't a bell curve? What if the true curve that we're reflecting is a staggered curve? Look down here at the bottom of the page, where on the horizontal axis we see the observed value, the frequency, and on the vertical axis we see the probability, the expected distribution. The red curve there is a bell curve, a standard, straightforward, normal distribution, the types of things you were graded on in kindergarten. The blue curve, however, is not a bell curve. It's skewed towards having a higher frequency of an event. It might be the kind of curve you'd see if a coin were loaded, where heads were more likely to come up than tails. That would just sort of reflect more of a curve on one end than on another. And so the curve might be skewed. And that means if we were trying to estimate the amount of chance, we couldn't do so in a hypothesis test if we were to have an incorrect assumption about what kind of curve it is we're dealing with. This will be a particularly important concept in financial accounting and financial analysis of risk, because what we discovered after the 2008 recession is that a lot of the models that people were using to estimate financial risk were based on standard, normal, Gaussian, bell curve type models, like this red curve here on this page. And what it turned out is that a lot of prices, including stock prices, commodity prices, and so forth, do not operate according to bell curves. Well, if you base your estimators based on frequencies all around bell curves, you're going to get incorrect estimates of risk by doing so. And that's indeed what has happened in the 2008 collapse. Here's an example of a hypothesis test just to put some meat on the bone for us. This study done by two Europeans in 2002 asked the question of whether the Belgian euro, a one Belgian coin euro, was loaded or not. They flipped it 250 times. Now, if the coin were fair, that is 50% of the time we'd expect it to come up heads, 50% of the time we'd expect it to come up tails, then we would estimate, if we had 250 tosses, that the probability of heads is that it would come up 125 times, and likewise 125 times tails. They didn't find that though. They found it came up heads 139 times, and it came up tails 111 times. Now notice this is a small number of tosses. It's not 5 million tosses or 2 billion tosses, where if it were a fair coin, we would expect the probability and frequency to be very close to each other. Instead, this is a small number of tosses, so they used a hypothesis test. If this were a fair coin, they said, where it really were supposed to come up as a probability of 50-50, 125 and 125, this extreme discrepancy, if a bell curve were correct, would be attributable to chance in 7% of identical experiments, they said. In other words, 7% of the time, you could expect to have 14 fewer tails than expected and 14 more heads than expected, and it would be pure chance. An illusion if you were to say that the coin's loaded, when in fact it's not. How do you know that in fact the coin is not loaded or not? Well, it's not going to be a perfect guess. But what we can say is if the confidence interval is that 95% of the time we're going to rule out chance, then this is only 93% confidence. We can't actually say that this is an unfair coin at this point. It's not outside the realm of chance. This sort of concept about chance has also led for statisticians, psychologists, and others to do some interesting experiments. For example, in any small series of observations, chance can cause a wide variety of frequency patterns, including some runs which seem very highly improbable and make us think something is going on when in fact it's just pure chance. For example, if you flip a coin and it's a fair coin, you could get heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. But what's interesting is that series of outcomes is not more likely statistically than heads, 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 tails, 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 or even more interestingly, tails, heads, 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 tails, tails. If you saw 4 heads in a row, you might be shocked and say this is a loaded coin. In fact, it's not. It's no more likely an outcome than heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. Another statistic that might surprise some of you is that more than 50% of the time that a fair coin is flipped 20 times, you'll get a series of 4 heads in a row. Another interesting statistic by Gilovich in 1993 says that the chances are greater than 50% that any small California neighborhood will have a statistically significant cancer cluster. That is, that will rule out chance at a 95% level. It's very interesting that we seem to have clusters of cancer, and yet it's pure chance in over half the communities in California. The lesson to take from this is what's called the gambler's fallacy or the clustering illusion, put forward by Tversky and Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for other work, when they talked about the law of small numbers. And in that study, what they were basically saying, and Kahneman has later expanded on, is to say that oftentimes we have confidence that there's some meaningful trend or pattern that we're seeing. But statistics helps us to see that a lot of this that's going on is just chance. There's no specific trend, no meaning, and yet we, by our own biases, want to inject meaning into something that is pure randomness. Another example of this is in scoring streaks. Tversky did this study along with Gilovich in 1985. They looked at the 1980 to 1981 Philadelphia 76ers basketball team, which was considered the streakiest team in the NBA history. Hot when they were hot, cold when they were cold. What they found was interesting. They looked over the entire season of statistics for that team. And in looking at it, they found that no 76er player was any more likely to hit or miss their next shot based on whether they had hit or missed their previous shot, or based on whether they had hit or missed the last 3 shots in a row. In other words, they couldn't find a trend of streakiness, even though the general public had a consensus that this was a very streaky team. Their conclusion was there is not evidence that players have scoring streaks. The sequences of hits and misses can be explained by chance alone. Psychologically, they said, people are inclined to find patterns in pure noise, just chance. They called this psychological anchoring. We need to have an anchor to hold on to in the world of randomness, and so we create anchors that are in fact illusions. And they use statistics to peel back the cover on this. Now, I know what some of you are probably saying. Well, I can think of other things that cause streakiness that they didn't take into account. And indeed, a lot of people doubted this study initially, and so there were a lot of second and third generation studies to follow up on what Tversky had done in this original study that tried to take into account other variables that might have affected the outcomes that were not accounted for in that original hot streak study. People looked, for example, at the difficulty of a shot, how much time had elapsed between a player's shots, whether the announcer or the crowd went wild after a shot, lots of different variables. And what they found was consistently that whatever variables they took into account, and for various sports, baseball, tennis, golf, hockey, horse racing, or football, they found that in all of these circumstances, chance could not be ruled out as the cause of any of these sorts of random streaks that people found. The only circumstance where they actually did find, to my knowledge, examples of where streaks were not random and there was some ability to control the streak was golf putting under laboratory conditions. So maybe Tiger Woods not streaky, but everybody else is in terms of chance. I'm sorry, I should say it the other way around. Everyone is not streaky except Tiger Woods, who is. That leads to an interesting point, which is that perhaps statistics themselves are misleading if they're not ruling out chance or factors beyond people's control. For example, in the past, people have used ERAs, earned run averages, to account for baseball pitchers' ability to pitch well. Earned run average, however, depends not just on the pitcher's ability, but also on the defense of his team. For example, how many innings he's pitched, how many runs have been allowed, how many earned runs there are, or sacrifice hits, or sacrifice flies, or errors by the defense, and so forth. It doesn't measure just what the pitcher has done in terms of the hits he has allowed. The number of hits a pitcher allows is not predicted by the past number of hits he has permitted, it turns out. So including this in an ERA calculation creates a misleading statistic attributing chance to a specific source, namely the pitcher. Instead, what teams have done, and this is a most gloried example of this is in the famous movie Moneyball, which I'm sure some of you have seen, was that they created a new statistic, some teams, called the Defense Independent Pitching Statistic, or DIPS, to replace the ERA. Here they look purely at what pitchers do, whether they had unintentional walks, whether they struck people out, whether they allowed up home runs, whether they allowed to hit batsmen, or whether they gave intentional walks. These are things that largely depend on the pitcher and not on chance beyond the pitcher's control. And by doing so, it gives a more reflective, truer estimate of what is in fact the phenomenon of good pitching and what is in fact chance and randomness beyond the pitcher's control. It allows you to select better players for your team, and indeed the Oakland A's succeeded and went to the World Series precisely by using dips as a statistic rather than the traditional ERA. Okay, we've done enough with statistics and probability for today. What I want to leave you with from what we learned today was that probability and statistics in the 20th century were found to be useful tools because they are often effective in controlling two major sources of illusions: cognitive bias and chance. However, among cognitive biases, it is not necessarily the case that statistics are good at removing observational or sampling biases. So that's what I want to leave you with, and we're going to turn to these topics in future lectures as we continue our way through the causation studies. Have a good day. I'll see you on the chat boards.